Welcome to the Lee Library and our exhibit of photos and memorabilia from the Lee Library Historical Collection. My name is Mary Philpott and this is John Philpott, and we grew up and were raised in a paper city in Holyoke. John's grandfather and his uncles worked in the paper mills, and John worked in the paper mills during college and then continued his career in the paper industry after college. And we would like to talk a little bit about the technological advances in the paper industry as well as the paper process, and that will be John's role in this tour. Our tour begins with the history of the Lee paper industry. The title of our exhibit is The Paper Industry in Lee, the People, the Mills, and the Contributions. We will begin with the history of the first paper mills, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the pioneers in the paper industry, the mills that supported the paper industry, as well as the hardworking citizens who worked in the mills. I hope you'll enjoy this glimpse of the paper industry and a little bit of our Lee town history.
I'd like to talk a little bit about the paper manufacturing process, which is critical to the development of the paper industry in the town of Lee. Basically, paper consists of raw materials of wood pulp, fillers which are starch or clays, something that is called broke in the paper industry, which is paper that was made through the process but didn't meet the specifications and is sent back to be repulped, and the most important component of everything is water. We begin the process by mixing the materials in a vat which we call a hydropulper, which is similar to a whirring blender. From the hydropulper, we pump to what we call a mixing chest, which takes the batch process from the hydropulper and supplies the beginning of the slurry to the paper machine operation. From the mixing chest, we go to the machine chest, which is the beginning of the wet end of the paper machine. Machine chest stock at this point has 96 parts water, and you'll find that the amount of water as we go closer to the forming section will be quite a bit more water, and that's the secret of paper making. From the machine chest we go to the refiners, and the refiners are essentially rotating steel bars, and the purpose of these is to take the wood fiber length, change the fiber length to the desired properties that fit the final specifications of the paper. This is a very critical part and very energy consuming area. From after refining, the slurry is then diluted to 99.9 parts of water. After the refining operation, this refined stock is diluted further and put into a distribution pond, which we call a head box. At this point, the stock slurry is 99.95% water, and the purpose of the head box is to distribute the slurry in a uniform fashion to start a well-formed sheet of paper. The slurry is then extruded onto a revolving wire screen, which is called a fournier. The purpose of the fournier is a dewatering type of system which takes the water from 99.95% water down to 82 parts water at the end of the fournier. At this point, the wet web of paper is strong enough to go through further processing, which is the squeezing of more water out of the web. We go through a series of rolls, just like ringers on an old washing machine, and the water goes from 82 parts water down to 60 parts water at the end of this process. From that process, what now has to go through the dryer sections. Dryer sections are basically steel cans or iron cans. They're heated with steam, and essentially they're drying the remaining water out of the sheet of paper to the point where the finished paper after drying is only 5 parts water. After the drying operation, the paper is just wound up on a reel in the form of master rolls, and these master rolls are then sent to further finishing in other parts of a paper mill.
We have a few items in this case from our collection. The first one is from the Clark Aiken Company, and we have some brochures of the products that they were selling, and that these were important machines for the paper industry, along with a plate that was attached to each of the machines before it went out. We also have some samples of blotting paper from the Eaton-Dyckman Mill. And the Eaton-Dyckman Mill was located near our present post office and was destroyed in a fire in 1932. And if you're old enough, then you would remember about using some of the blotting paper, and especially you'll see evidence where it was needed in some of the ledgers that we have here on display. And John, do you want to comment a little bit about fires and the paper mill?
Essentially, fires in all the paper mills has always been a threat, and the early mills especially were very prone to fires. The mills were basically wooden structures with no sprinkler systems or no fire suppression systems in the mills themselves. Their main source of heating and steam generation primarily was wood, and the sparks from the wood fires would create fire in the mills and the chimneys and in the structures themselves. The local fire departments at the time did not have much equipment, and the basic fire suppression system that the mill had was the bucket brigade, which obviously is not a very efficient source of trying to put water out. But even today, the modern paper mills are worried about fires because welder sparks, lightning, electrical shorts have created fires in many of the even modern mills with the latest sprinkling systems and done terrible damage from time to time. The fires in paper mills have always been a serious threat throughout the ages. Especially in the early mills, which were constructed of wood. The mills had no fire sprinklers or fire suppression systems or things of that nature. Main source of heat and supply was wood, which created a lot of sparks that would get involved with chimneys in the area of the structure, of the wooden structures, as well as the paper, which is very flammable. The fire departments of the day had very little equipment to fight an industrial fire, and basically in the early days the fire suppression system was primarily a bucket brigade. This was obviously not very effective, and in the early mills there was a number of them that burnt to the ground. Even today's modern mill have problems with the fires in the sense that welding sparks, electricity shorts, and lightning have created major fires in some of the modern pulp and paper mills in the country today.
In our next case, we also have some more samples from our collection. The first one is dies that were made for medals, for the bicentennial medals for the Lee Bicentennial. And the person who designed this medal was Wally DeFries, who worked in the Eagle Mill for a long time and was also our neighbor. And then we also have a record of the directors' meetings dated from April 1889 to January 1905 of the Smith Paper Company. And it's very interesting because it shows all the details and what has happened during the meetings. And our second ledger that we have is even more interesting because it has very detailed testing of the paper and the costs of all the materials that were being used at the time. And this is dated from March 1889 or 79.
I want to suggest that as the paper industry developed, the testing of the paper became much more important. Specifications from customers became tighter and more diverse. And a good, successful paper operation needed to have a strong quality area. Paper was tested for various weights, tear, tensile, cleanliness, smoothness, and a number of parameters that the customers required that had to be tested in the paper operation that had a successful quality operation generally was commercially successful.
We also have a sample paper napkin from the C. Elmer Pope Company that was a company in the rebuilt Decker-Sabin Company. And the Decker-Sabin Company was one of the mills destroyed in the 1886 flood. And this was given to the collection by Frank Gardner, and he worked in the mill. And the next is a very interesting piece that we have in our collection, and this is a specimen of a banknote paper that was made in Lee during the Civil War. In 1862, the Lynn and Dean Mill, which was located on Lake May Stream, which is now Goose Pond Stream, was found to be making banknote paper with the CSA on it. Mr. Lynn was summoned before the district court in Boston and was either very ingenious or a great patriot. According to his story, he was carrying out orders given by a group of Union sympathizers who planned to flood the South with quantities of counterfeit Confederate bills. The value of the Southern money would be destroyed and the war would be over. The case was postponed and apparently was never tried. Mr. Lynn disappeared, and the truth of the story remains a mystery, but you can see the CSA for the Confederate States of America on the paper. Now we'll look at the photos and illustrations in our exhibit. First, we have a map from 1876 of the location of the paper mills in Lee. By 1857, Lee had 25 paper mills. Our second illustration is from the Pittsfield Directory listing all the types of paper being made in Lee. So John, do you want to comment about why Lee had so many paper mills?
The topography of Lee was essential to the growth of the paper industry. The fact that there is lots of water, lots of streams that could be dammed up to provide water and water power to the paper mills was a very big part of the successful paper industry at Lee. Additionally, the fact that there was a number of areas to get wood and wood fibers to the paper mill and to build the factories was very close at hand and economically attractive. Another aspect of it was that there was numerous skilled workforces from both different suppliers, the farms, the machine shops that were supporting both the farmers and the industries that were in the area. This skilled workforce was instrumental, I think, as the mills were growing. Another aspect of why Lee had so many mills was that there was a group of business folks that were very much risk takers. They had the ability to look at, say, what they could develop. They had the funds or could get funds in which to build the mills. And the combination of all of these factors provided a perfect environment for the growth of the paper industry as we know it, especially in the 1800s.
Next we have S.S. May, one of the owners of the May Paper Company. And the May Paper Company also was supplied with power by Lake May, and which is Goose Pond. And next to that we have an article that's cut out from the Gleaner from 1899 that talks about the Eastleigh Mills and how they were the Berkshire's first Ford and Air machines being set up there. And so we have the Eaton May Robbins paper mill and where this machine was installed. And there's a diagram of this machine. And John's going to comment a little bit about why the Ford and Air was so important to the paper industry.
In the paper making technical advancements, the Ford Near reaches one of the most significant advancements in the industry. Prior to the Ford Near invention, all paper from the Chinese on was a batch type of process. The fibers would be mixed with water. They would be then screened by hand. Then they would be what we call cooched, to take some of the water out of the screened paper, and then they would be air dried for the most part. This was very time consuming, labor intensive, and led a lot to be desired in terms of growth of the industry. Around 1800, two brothers called Ford Near got a system of which a revolving screen could be used to manufacture the paper. This provided a continuous operation that eliminated the need for the vat type of process and was developed and patented by the Ford Near brothers. The Ford Near developed pretty rapidly from that time, and by the time of the Civil War, any progressive paper mill had a Ford Near operation somewhere in their mill environment. And as time went on, the Ford Near became faster, wider, and more sophisticated in terms of being able to form a sheet of wet paper to meet the desired properties in the final testing.
Next we have Thomas Hurlbut, who started the first paper mill in South Lee with Charles Owens. And below Mr. Hurlbut, we have a very romantic view of the mill, and this is the bridge to the Willow Mill. And during the 1960s, this was the opening scene in the popular TV series Peyton Place. And now below this romantic view of the mill is the real view of the mill, what it looked like in 1890 with the workforce lined up in front of the mill. And next we have a logo that was used in 1876 about the semi-centennial of the mill. And part of that logo is still found on the Willow Mill as you go by in South Lee. And below that you have the new Hurlbut paper mill, the Laurel Mill, which was built in 1958, and you see two views of that. And that's when the Hurlbut Mill became the Mead Paper Company.
The paper industry has always been dynamic in terms of changes of ownership, changes of mills, and the mills in Lee were no exception. The Hurlbut Paper Company was bought by the Mead Paper Company, which is a large U.S. paper operation headquartered in Chillicothe, Ohio. Mead, after a few years, then joined with Mead Westvaco in a merger and formed the Mead Westvaco organization. They decided to change the direction and strategy of their business, and they basically sold the Lee operation to the employees in the Willow Mill, which the employees formed a company called Onyx Specialty Papers, which has been in continuous operation since the transfer from Mead Westvaco to Onyx. The Onyx paper mill is one of only two left in the Berkshire County at this point.
In 1808, the second paper mill was built in Lee, where the Eagle Mill of the Smith Paper Company stands. In 1864, the Smith Paper Company was formed by Elizur Smith and his two nephews, Wellington and DeWitt. And we have an illustration of the four paper mills that were owned in the 1890s. And then we also have a picture of the Schweitzer brothers, who then bought out the Smith Paper Company.
The Schweitzer brothers had a large paper making operation. They had mills in New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, and Minnesota, and they specialized in lightweight, specialty, and technically advanced papers at the time. They were looking to expand their business, and one of the businesses they did look to merge with was the Smith Paper Company, which also manufactured very special, lightweight, technically advanced papers. 1950, the merge was successful, and it became the Schweitzer the Schweitzer organization. As the Schweitzer brothers, of which Lou and Bill and later on Peter J. Schweitzer got older, they needed to value their estate. In order to do that, they decided to sell their paper operation, and they were looking at large paper companies where they could merge. They entered talks with Kimberly-Clark and merged with Kimberly-Clark to form the Schweitzer division of Kimberly-Clark. At the time of the merger, the Schweitzer brothers were the largest shareholders in Kimberly-Clark.
Now we'll go back for a moment to the Columbia paper mill because it has an important place in paper mill history.
One of the interesting things about the Columbia mill was that the Smith Paper Company was very adept at looking at technical innovation. One of the issues that prompted this was the fact that the raw material that supplied for the paper industry was getting expensive and short, which was primarily rags. The Smith Paper Company found a operation that would take wood chips, dilute it with caustic soda, and boil the chips to form a pulp. The Smith Paper Company thought this was a cheap material that may be used to bake paper. They contracted out a year's supply of this cooked wood chips to experiment on making paper, and therefore the Columbia mill became the first mill to use and explore the possibility of wood fiber for paper making operations. And of course, wood fiber is a primary raw material in the world today for paper making.
We have a photo here of Wellington Smith, and in the same frame below him we have a picture of his house. And the home of Wellington Smith, which is shown in 1890 to 1900, is now the Kelly Funeral Home on Main Street. And below that we have an obituary of Wellington Smith, which is quite a read. And then we go along to the Eagle Paper Mill, which Kimberly-Clark owned in the 1960s, sorry. And then below that, a picture of Leo Scolforo in the 1940s. Leo Scolforo is a backtender on machine number 6 at the Eagle Mill, and this was used as a promotional photo, and Leo Scolforo is Peter Scolforo's dad. And then beyond that, we have some pictures of the Smith Paper employees, first from the 1890s and below that from the 1860s. And finally, we end our story on the Smith Company with the Eagle Mill and the Columbia Mill, and these are aerial photos that were taken in 1980 of each of the mills. The next portrait is that of James H. Royce in 1862, and he converted a factory that was weaving grain bags into a mill for the manufacture of pulp from the native white poplar, which was in great demand during the war, and which took the place of rags in the manufacture of newspapers and book papers. And this portrait is by Cutting of Lee, and C.P. Cutting of Lee took a number of wonderful portraits and pictures during that time. The next photos are of the Baird paper mills. There were 3 Baird mills, and Prentice C. and George Baird were among the pioneers of papermaking in East Lee. One of the photos on the right is dated June 15, 1889. P.C. Baird mills made paper for paper collars, and these paper collars and the paper was sold mostly in New York and Boston. Mr. Prentice Baird represented the town of Lee in both branches of the legislature. These next photos show the damage of the flood of 1886, and these are near the junction of Goose Pond and Goose Brook and Greenwater Brook. And the mill at right is the Garfield Mill, and at left center the ruins of the McLaughlin Machine Shop and Foundry. Harrison Garfield was born in Lee in 1810. And he was in the business of producing fine writing paper. And Mr. Garfield, besides caring for his paper mills, was also engaged in agriculture and had one of the finest greenhouses. And he was also president of the Lee Library Association and served as a town selectman and represented the town in both houses of the legislature. Another paper mill was the Benton Brothers Mill, which later became the Mountain Mill. It was built in the early 1850s by Caleb Benton and Harrison Garfield. In 1949, this was the only one of the old Eastleigh mills still standing. Next we have the Chaffee and Hamlin's paper mill, 1876, and this was on Water Street. It was built in 1831, and it was destroyed by the 1886 flood and never rebuilt. The next photo shows the participation of the paper industry in town events. And this is the Tercentenary Parade in 1930 and the Eaton-Dyckman Paper Mill Parade float. And then we have the Thistle Wire Works, and these are the employees in the 1920s. And this was located on the corner of Center and Canal Streets. George Roberts was the proprietor, and left to right was an unidentified man. Tom Kerr, another person with the last name Fallon, William Bauer, two more people that were unidentified, Joe Devine, somebody else unidentified, a Scotsman who lived across the street, Frank Dutch Mole, and Tom Bauer. George Roberts was the grandfather of Dorothy Roberts Nettleton. So, do you want to comment about the wire works and the wires in the paper industry?
The paper industry, with the advent of the Ford Near, was very dependent on wire screens to form their sheets of paper. Any paper mill needed a supplier close by to provide the Ford Near material, and the Ford Nears themselves were very substantially quick to be damaged. They also wore out very quickly. And as the paper industry progressed, the technical development of the wire weaving area became even more important.
The first mill here is the Mahawi Mill from 1880 to 1890, and you can notice all the wood pulp and wood piled up all on the sides of the mill, ready to be processed at this mill. And the second photo is the rear of the Decker and Sabin paper mill after the 1886 flood. This mill stood on Water Street, not far below where the electric power plant stood, and this was one mill that was not rebuilt. Another important industry for the paper mills in Lee, as well as elsewhere, is the Spencer Company that produced the revolving paper cutters. And these are photos from the 1880s, and you can see them lined up on the Lee station, and Lee Railroad Station, on the platform ready to be shipped. One of the ads for the revolving paper cutter, the Clark and Spencer revolving paper cutter, is shown on the right. And then the final document is the document in which this company was dissolved, and it would just be owned by Clark. And next to it is a photo of Mr. Clark.
The rotary cutters of 1880 were very sophisticated machines, and they were a state-of-the-art cutter. And the rotary cutters, which, like the Ford Near, provided a much more efficient finishing operation, being able to take master roll right from the reel of a paper machine and cut the paper to the proper sheets on a continuous basis. They're also very flexible in terms of being able to change sizes and things of that nature. And this was very highly technical and skilled craftsmen needed to build these machines.
The next two photos show the Mountain Mill girls and the Mountain Mill boys, taken around 1910. And in the photo of the Mountain Mill girls, standing are Ora Melius Turner, Bill Eckert, and Gladys Griffin. And then seated in the first row, Ellen Jones Coates, Nellie Weeks, and there was a youngster between them, Jean Hall, Marguerite Glassett, somebody who was unidentified, Martha Giles, Bruno, and then 3 others unidentified. And standing are 4 unidentified people, Lucy Melius Butler, Florence Melius Kelsey, Ruth Eckert, somebody unidentified, Helen Lasher, unidentified, Jean Booth, and Helen Coates. For the Mountain Mill boys, and this picture was taken in front of the Graham House on Main Street, Lee, which is the house directly across the street from the library. And on the ground we have Percy Ayers, Bill Eckert, Martin Hussey, and seated on the truck are, the first 2 are unidentified, Tracy Griffin, Ed Smith, somebody named Jack, Bill Duquette, and an unknown person, Evan Muirhead, Irving Turner, who was called Ellie. And the second row, and the standing in the first row, the first 4 are missing, the Poli Bruno, next to are missing, and Bill Butler. On top of the cab, Clarence Mann. Standing at the extreme left, perhaps it's George Jones, Art Haskell, or Lou Kilmer. And the next 2 are missing, and then John Janes. Next we'll talk a little bit about the Tanner and Perkins machine shop. And this is a later picture of the shop. And standing in front of it is E.P. Tanner, George Tanner, J. Albert Tanner, H. Chase, William Grosser, William Dragoin, Louis Olds, and Charles F. Smith. And this was in the 1880s. And below that is the Tanner shop with the entire workforce standing in front of it. Next we have portraits of the Tanner members of the Tanner family, from the father who ran the shop from the 1840s to his son who was associated with the shop, the family picture, and then finally the picture of Water Street looking north about 1885. And this had the machine shop as well as the residence of the Edward Tanner family. And Mr. Tanner eventually sold his business to Henry Clark, who later took on Walter Aiken in this, and in the end this becomes the Clark-Aiken Company. Then we have a group photo of the Clark-Aiken staff in 1925, and it starts off with John Norton, Jacob Sewells, Michael Norton, George Carter, Robert Hall, Charles Melius, Tom Lyons, Edward Martin, Fred Garner, Michael Sullivan, James Church, George O'Loughlin, Fred John, William Kelsey, Jack Keenan, somebody's missing, then John Blake, George Garner, and Albert Schwab. And then the staff in 1940 of the Clark-Aiken Company, and the first person is Hugh Sutton, Walter Aiken, Edward Martin, Fred Sutton, Richard Latimer, William Finnegan, Michael Sullivan, Henry Sewells, Fred Mary, and then we have Fred Kiefner, Jacob Sewells, Emil Doer, Leroy Toby, Helen Barrett, Robert Finnegan, Fred John, Robert McCarthy, John Blake, William Murray, Eugene Aroli, William Tyre, Larry Carter, and James Bianco. And finally, we end with the pictures of the Clark-Aiken Company in 1968 after the flood. And we have 3 pictures of the damage from that flood, 2 of the interior, and finally the last picture is of the outside of the mill and the water coming down the street.
I think the paper industry as it developed in Lee was instrumental in the growth of changing Lee from a strictly agricultural town to a well-diverse town that could manufacture many different products and provide a huge amount of jobs for the town. The culture that was established in the early paper-making era has survived the time, and we are enjoying the benefit of that to this very day.
Thank you for sharing your expertise and your information about the paper industry. I hope you have enjoyed this glimpse of Lee's past as well as some of the more recent present. And I hope if you would like to see more pictures, you would look on the Lee Library website for a link to these pictures on the internet. Thank you very much.